Wait, you were the woman I ignored that night?
The woman you thought was another forgotten customer.
Why didn't you tell me who you were?
Because I wanted to see if my restaurant still remembered the promise I made to my mother.
Your mother.
She was humiliated in this same building 50 years ago. And tonight, history almost repeated itself.
Who are you really?
The woman who built everything you're standing on.
Victoria rose from the table without a single word of complaint, laid enough cash beside her plate to cover a meal she had not eaten, and thanked Rosa by name on her way toward the door, a small kindness that startled the young server more than any scolding could have. Gregory Voss never once turned his head to watch her go, still occupied with Whitney Adler's table, still certain that whoever had just left table 14 mattered less to his evening than the wine list in his hand. He had no way of knowing that the woman walking calmly into the cold night outside had built the very floor beneath his feet, brick by brick, decade by decade, out of a promise made in a hospital room that still lived in her chest every single day of her life. To understand what Victoria Sinclair carried out of that restaurant, you had to go back nearly 50 years to a woman named Odessa Sinclair, who spent her days scrubbing floors in hotels she could never afford to stay in and her nights raising a daughter alone on wages that barely stretched to cover rent. Odessa believed, fiercely and without apology, that her daughter deserved every good thing this world had to offer, even when the world made it clear, again and again, that it disagreed. She worked double shifts folding linens for guests who never learned her name, and she never once let her daughter see her tired, not until the night everything came apart in front of her. The night in question came the week Victoria won a scholarship that would carry her clear out of the only life she'd ever known, and Odessa decided, against every practical instinct she had, that the occasion deserved a proper celebration. She saved for nearly 2 months, set aside a single good dress, and took her daughter to a restaurant downtown known for its white tablecloths and its reputation among the kind of people Odessa cleaned rooms for. They were seated near the kitchen without being told why, made to wait while other tables were served first, and eventually approached by a maitre d', who informed Odessa, quietly enough that only she could hear it, that perhaps this particular evening wasn't the right one for them after all. Victoria was 11 years old that night, too young to fully understand what had just happened, only old enough to notice that her mother's hand trembled slightly as she gathered their coats and led her back out into the cold without ever raising her voice or asking why. Odessa never explained it to her daughter, not that night, not in the years that followed, carrying the humiliation the way she carried most hard things in her life, silently, so the weight of it would land on her alone and nowhere else. It would take Victoria decades to understand that her mother's silence that night hadn't been shame at all. It had been a woman with no power choosing the only defense she had left. Victoria built her entire career on that single unspoken lesson, though it took her years to recognize it as the foundation it truly was. She opened her first restaurant at 28 with borrowed money and her mother's old recipe box, promising herself one thing above every other ambition she carried: that no one who ever walked through her doors would be made to feel the way her mother had been made to feel that night, regardless of what they wore, what they could afford, or what a maitre d' decided about them at a glance. That single diner became 2, then a dozen, then an empire spanning 40 cities, each location carrying some quiet piece of the promise Victoria made beside her mother's hospital bed the week Odessa finally lost the fight she'd carried silently for so long. It was that same promise that kept Victoria walking unannounced into her own restaurants decades after she could have simply trusted the reports crossing her desk each quarter. She believed, the way her mother had once believed in her, that the truest measure of any business wasn't the reviews it earned from people who already had power, but the way it treated the people who walked in with none. Her son Elliot, now vice president of operations, had gently suggested more than once that a woman worth what she was worth no longer needed to sit alone at corner tables verifying service with her own eyes. Victoria always answered him the same way. She said the day she stopped checking was the day she stopped deserving to run anything at all. Renee Okafor understood that conviction better than almost anyone alive, having worked beside Victoria since the earliest years of that first small diner, back when neither of them had $2 to rub together between them. She had become the company's chief operating officer over the years, but she remained, above every title, the one person Victoria trusted completely with the truth. It was Renee she called the morning after the spoiled plate at the Aurora, her voice steady but carrying something Renee had rarely heard in it before, a request not for comfort, but for a full and quiet audit of every location the company operated, starting with the flagship restaurant where she'd been served food that never should have left the kitchen. Renee didn't ask why immediately. She had learned long ago that Victoria's instincts about her own restaurants were rarely wrong, and she assembled a small trusted team within days, working carefully beneath the notice of regional management, pulling inspection reports, ingredient invoices, and staffing patterns from locations across the country. What the early findings revealed troubled her far more than a single bad plate ever could. The Aurora wasn't an isolated failure. It was one visible symptom of a pattern quietly repeated across several of the company's most profitable locations, where guests seated in less desirable sections were, without any official policy ever written down, served a noticeably lower standard of care. Word moved quickly through the Aurora's staff that a woman from Table 14 had somehow reached corporate with pointed questions, and Gregory Voss felt the shift in the building almost immediately, a tightening in every conversation he had with his regional director that week. He couldn't identify who she was, couldn't match a name to the plain gray coat he barely remembered, and the not knowing gnawed at him more than any direct confrontation would have. He pulled Rosa aside one afternoon, his tone pleasant but unmistakably pointed, reminding her that loyalty mattered in this industry, that careers could end over the wrong words said to the wrong person at the wrong time. Rosa said nothing to him, though she carried the conversation home with her that night, turning it over long after her shift had ended. She had liked the quiet woman at Table 14, had felt something close to protectiveness toward her without ever understanding why, and Gregory's thinly veiled warning only confirmed something she had already begun to suspect on her own. Whatever had happened that evening, it was bigger than a single overcooked dish sent out of a rushed kitchen. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, to keep her own private record of what she saw on the floor each night, the tables treated with warmth and the tables treated as an inconvenience. Adrian Boyd carried his own version of that same discomfort, heavier because he was the one who had plated the ruined dish with his own hands. He told himself, in the days that followed, that he'd only been following orders in a kitchen where following orders was the entire job, but the excuse sat worse in his stomach each time he tried it on. When Renee's audit team quietly requested kitchen logs from the past year, Adrian handed them over without hesitation, along with something no one had asked for yet, a private notebook of his own where he'd started writing down every instance he could remember of food quality decisions made based on who was sitting at the table rather than what the kitchen owed any guest at all. While Renee's team worked quietly beneath the surface, a very different kind of maneuvering was taking place several floors above them. Inside a boardroom where Nathaniel Cross had spent 2 years waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Cross had chaired the board since before Victoria took the company public on the smaller exchange years earlier, and he had never fully forgiven her for refusing to sacrifice service standards for margin the way he believed any properly run public company eventually had to. He learned of the audit within days through a regional director loyal to him rather than to Victoria, and instead of alarm, what Cross felt most was opportunity, the first real leverage he'd been handed in years. Cross began making calls that week, careful and unhurried, framing the audit not as Victoria's diligence, but as evidence that quality control had already slipped badly enough to require this level of scrutiny in the first place. He suggested, gently and only to the board members he trusted most, that perhaps a founder nearing 60 wasn't as attuned to the daily realities of the business as she once had been, that perhaps the upcoming public offering deserved leadership the market would read as more modern, more forward-facing. He never once said Victoria's name directly in these conversations. He didn't need to. Every person listening understood exactly who he meant. The emergency board session called 2 weeks later opened with language carefully chosen to sound like concern rather than ambition. Phrases about protecting shareholder value and ensuring stability ahead of the offering. Phrases that left Victoria sitting perfectly still at the head of a table she had built with her own 2 hands, listening to men discuss whether she still belonged in the room. Elliot sat near the far end that day, caught between the mother who raised him and the board members whose approval his own future in the company would eventually depend on, saying far less in that meeting than he wanted to, a silence that troubled him long after the room had emptied out. Victoria left that meeting with an offer on the table she hadn't asked for and didn't want, language suggesting she stepped back temporarily from daily operations while the audit concluded, optics dressed up as concern for her own well-being. She understood immediately what accepting that offer would actually mean, not a pause, but the beginning of an ending Cross had been quietly writing for years. That night she sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home. The old newspaper photograph of a restaurant called the Kensington Room still framed on the wall behind her desk. A photograph she had never once explained to Renee, or to Elliot, or to anyone else in her life. She drove out to the cemetery the following morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, standing alone in front of a headstone that read simply Odessa Sinclair, beloved mother. The flowers she'd brought still damp with dew by the time she set them down. She told her mother, out loud, in a voice no one else could hear, about the plate at the Aurora, about Gregory Voss and Whitney Adler and Rose's careful hesitation near the kitchen door. She admitted, for the first time since building this entire company, that she had spent 40 years assuming the promise she made in that hospital room had already been kept, and that one quiet Tuesday evening had shown her exactly how wrong that assumption truly was. Standing there in the cold morning air, Victoria understood with sudden and complete clarity that the choice in front of her was never really about protecting her own position at all. Settling quietly, stepping back the way Cross wanted, allowing Gregory Voss to be quietly removed as a convenient scapegoat while the deeper pattern across the company stayed buried, would only repeat the same silence her mother had been forced into that night decades earlier, a silence born of having no power to fight back. Victoria had power now, more of it than her mother could have ever imagined possible. The only question left was whether she intended to use it, or whether she'd simply become another version of the people who'd once turned her mother away at the door. She called Renee that same afternoon and told her to expand the audit fully, no exceptions, no regional director's approval required, reaching directly into every acquisition file the company had ever absorbed since its earliest years, including the flagship building itself. It was 3 days later that Renee called her back, her voice carrying a stillness Victoria had rarely heard from her closest friend in 30 years of working side by side. Buried in decades-old acquisition paperwork, long before Sinclair Hospitality had purchased and renovated the building into what was now known as the Aurora, the property had operated under an entirely different name. It had once been called the Kensington Room. Victoria sat with the phone pressed to her ear for a long moment before she could bring herself to ask the next question, though some part of her had already begun to understand the shape of what Renee was about to tell her. Renee had pulled the old employment records from that era out of simple procedural thoroughness, cross-referencing former staff names as part of the audit's standard practice, and one name on that decades-old payroll list stopped her cold the moment she recognized it. The maitre d' listed at the Kensington Room during the exact years Victoria would have been a child was a man named Walter Voss. Renee didn't yet know why the name mattered so much. Victoria knew immediately and completely exactly why it did. Gregory Voss was Walter Voss's grandson, a fact he had mentioned himself, offhandedly and without weight, during his very first interview with the company 6 years earlier, proud of a family history in fine dining that stretched back generations in this very city. Neither he nor anyone else at Sinclair Hospitality had ever connected that pride to the building he now managed, because neither he nor anyone else had any reason to know that the small girl turned away from a table at the Kensington Room decades earlier by his own grandfather had grown up to buy that very building, rename it, and eventually walk back through its doors as a stranger no one bothered to recognize. Victoria requested a private meeting with Gregory the following week, choosing neutral ground rather than her own office, wanting to watch his face without the weight of her title sitting between them before she said anything at all. She told him plainly who she was, watching recognition and horror move across his expression in the same instant, watching him try and fail to reconcile the woman from table 14 with the founder whose name appeared on every piece of company letterhead he'd ever signed. Then she told him the rest, quietly, without theater, about his grandfather, about a night decades earlier at this exact address, about a humiliated woman and a daughter too young to understand what had just happened to them both. Gregory sat in complete silence for a long moment after Victoria finished speaking, the color draining slowly from his face as the full weight of what she'd told him settled somewhere he clearly hadn't expected it to land. He hadn't known his grandfather's history at the Kensington Room in any real detail, only family stories polished smooth by decades of retelling, stories that conveniently left out exactly which guests had been welcomed through those doors and which had been turned away at a glance. He told Victoria, his voice unsteady in a way she had never once heard from him, that he had no idea, that knowing changed absolutely nothing about what he'd done and everything about how he understood why he'd done it. Victoria didn't offer him comfort in that moment, and she didn't offer him cruelty either, sitting instead with the uncomfortable truth that inherited blindness and inherited pain had somehow found their way back to the exact same room a second time, 1 generation later. Neither man nor woman fully aware of the other's history until it was already too late to have prevented what happened. She told Gregory plainly that understanding where his contempt had come from didn't excuse a single decision he'd made in that kitchen, that Rosa and Adrian had both paid a quiet price for his choices, and that accountability, real and immediate, was still coming regardless of what either of their grandparents had done decades before either of them were born. The shareholder meeting Victoria called herself, ahead of anything Cross had planned, opened not with an apology, but with the full audit laid out plainly across every screen in the room, falsified quality reports spanning multiple cities, a documented pattern of guests treated according to perceived wealth rather than any standard the company claimed publicly to uphold, and a regional director whose signature appeared on inspection paperwork that never should have passed at all. Victoria named Nathaniel Cross directly, laying out the calls he'd made in the weeks prior, the quiet suggestions to board members that her diligence be read instead as her decline, and the plain fact that he had chosen leverage over accountability the moment he'd learned what the audit contained. The room sat in a silence heavier than any Victoria had experienced in decades of running this company. Board members who had trusted Cross's version of events now confronted with a very different one, laid out in documents that left no real room for argument. Cross was removed from the board within the hour, the vote nearly unanimous, his carefully built case against Victoria collapsing the moment the actual evidence reached people who hadn't already made up their minds. The regional director whose falsified paperwork had allowed the pattern to continue unchecked for years was terminated the same week, along with 2 others further down the chain who had known and said nothing rather than risk their own positions. Gregory Voss lost his position at the Aurora, a consequence Victoria never once softened or reconsidered no matter what she'd learned about his family history, because accountability, she told him plainly, could hold two truths at once without contradiction. What she offered him instead of public disgrace was something quieter, a chance to actually understand what he had done and to do the slower, harder work of making it right. An opportunity his own grandfather had never once extended to the family Gregory had unknowingly wronged a second time. Rosa Jimenez was promoted into a genuine leadership role within the company that same month, and Adrian Boyd's early honesty with the audit team was formally recognized in front of the entire executive staff. Elliot, who had sat mostly silent through the board's early maneuvering, stood fully and publicly behind his mother once the truth came fully into the light, later admitting to her privately that watching Cross nearly succeed had taught him more about what leadership actually required than any business degree ever had. The public offering proceeded months later than originally planned, but it proceeded on stronger footing than before, built now on a company that had faced its worst failure directly rather than burying it. A distinction investors and the public both noticed far more than Cross had ever predicted they would. The Aurora reopened after a brief renovation with a small brass plaque near its entrance, dedicated quietly to Odessa Sinclair, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a plain statement of the standard the restaurant now held itself to for every guest who walked through its doors. Sinclair Hospitality rebuilt its unannounced visit program company-wide that same year, this time with real consequences attached rather than quiet tolerance. Every location required to answer for how it treated the guests least likely to complain. Months later, on an ordinary evening much like the one that started all of this, Victoria walked once more into the Aurora in a plain gray coat, unrecognized, and was seated warmly, without hesitation, at whichever table happened to be open that night. She ate the entire meal in peace, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she let herself simply enjoy it.